Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are participating from. My name is Mi-Jung Hibit, Executive Director of the Global Chamber of Baltimore and Washington. First of all, before welcoming everybody to our Globinar today, managing and mitigating risk for international business, I wish all of you and your family continue to remain safe and well. The Global Chamber is a member-supported organization with a mission to promote cross-border commerce and trade by enabling businesses' local connections at a global scale. Please reach out to me and Doug and Cesar at our headquarters to find out about who we are and how we can assist you and your business specifically. Today we have a great turnout. Members and future members from many different parts of the world, not only from the US, Maryland, Virginia, Denver, Arizona, California, and many others, but also from overseas, such as Canada, England, Germany, Austria, Mexico, India, and many other countries are here. This seminar was first planned as an in-person event through collaboration with the prestigious ASU Thunderbird School of Global Management, but due to COVID-19, we changed it to this virtual event. I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you again to the Thunderbird School of Global Management for the support it has provided for the event both back then and until now. And it is our intention to continue our dialogue on the topic of new risk and the international business, how should it prepare and even thrive, during the crisis. So next time, I hope it'll be an in-person event at ASU building in Washington, DC. With that, I'd like to yield the floor to Brenda, who is our moderator today. And she is President and founder of Adaptive Leadership Strategies in DC and the board chair of the Global Chamber, Baltimore, Washington. Brenda, please.
Thank you, Mi-Jung, and welcome everyone to our conversation today. As Mi-Jung stated, we had been planning this forum prior to our COVID-19 reality, and we quickly realized that as a result of this that we needed to think about having a more relevant focus. And so I want to thank our panelists first and foremost for working so closely together to really elevate and move the conversation forward that we're going to have today, to not only focus on risks that are ever present in our operations, but also to help us think about the what's next and to think a little bit more broadly. So thank you for that. What we're going to do today, I'm going to start by introducing our esteemed panel, and then we're going to go through one by one to have them present their topics and information. Followed by that, we'll have an opportunity to open it up and entertain questions from the audience. So please prepare to use your Q&A panel on your dashboard to present questions to us, and we will channel them to the panelists. So I want to first start by introducing all of the panelists we'll be hearing from today. First will be Brett Bruin. Brett is president of the Global Situation Room, which is a consulting firm that specializes in helping clients navigate complex communication challenges. During 12 years as a US diplomat, Brett became a specialist in using strategic communications to influence the course of crisis and conflict. As Director of Global Engagement at the White House, he coordinated the United States government public diplomacy, international media and crisis communications, and global entrepreneurship programs. So Brett will be joining us in just a few minutes. Next is Lee Connor. Lee Connor is president of John S. Connor Incorporated, based in Baltimore. The company is a freight forwarder, customs broker, and NVOCC ship agent. He's responsible for the strategic decision and operation for the firm, which was established in 1917 by his grandfather. Brett has been with the company since 1981. He joined after completing law school at the University of Baltimore, and he's worked in a variety of positions at the firm. Since 1988, he's been on the board of the firm, and he assumed his current role as president in 1991. So welcome. Dr. Ann Florini is clinical professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, Arizona State University. She directs programs at the Washington, D.C. campus, close by here. Her teaching and research focus are on complex systems, the climate crisis, energy policy, and cross-sector collaborations involving business, government, and civil society. And boy, do we need to hear more about that now. Dr. Florini has spearheaded major international projects focused on innovative approaches to global problem solving, such organizations as the World Economic Forum. She has also run programs and taught at the National University of Singapore, Singapore Management University, and the Brookings Institution, as well as Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Trevor Jones is the founder of Links Global Intelligence, a company focused on finding solutions to global problems using technology. Mr. Jones's background includes geopolitical risk consulting and complex decision-making during humanitarian crises. He has served as a fellow at the Denver Council on Foreign Relations and has presented his research on complex adaptive systems to the United States Department of State. He also serves on the board of the Denver Global Chamber, where he assists in promoting Denver as a global city. And we also have Dr. Ethan B. Kapstein. Ethan Kapstein is currently Arizona's Centennial Professor of International Affairs at the School of Public Affairs and Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. He's also Associate Director of the Empirical Studies of Conflict Project at Princeton University. Kapstein's research focuses on international economic relations and economic development with a particular focus on conflict-affected states. He has served in the US government, the US Navy, thank you for your service, and in international organizations. His current research is examining US efforts to promote private enterprise across the developing world during and since the Cold War. So as you can see, we have a lot to talk about today, and I'm going to get right to it. When we were planning the conversation for today, and particularly when we were thinking about how to zero in on making it more relevant for what we're all experiencing right now, comments offered by Dr. Florini I thought were very relevant in helping us to set the tone, kind of the big picture of what our conversation will encompass today. So I'm going to turn the floor over now to Ann Florini to ask her to help us set the tone and get into the right mindset for the conversation we're about to participate in. Ann?
Thank you, Brenda. And let me start by thanking the Global Chamber for partnering with the Thunderbird School of Global Management in this event. We hope this is the first of many. I think we can think about the pressures of the pandemic as forcing a really overdue reckoning with how we make decisions and how we consider uncertainty and risk. We've seen the same kind of lesson from the 2008 global financial crisis, which really demonstrated the need for sector-wide systemic decision-making instead of the very focused piece-by-piece kind of decision-making that we've been doing for most of the 20th century. And these kind of apparent bolts from the blue are going to keep coming. That's because they'll be driven by the grave fragilities that we've been hearing so much about in political social systems and economic systems, as well as the creaking natural environmental infrastructure that we have now stressed to the point of collapse. And all of this requires a different set of mindsets and a different set of decision tools and techniques than the ones we have been using and training people to use.
Thank you so much. You know, a term that we're all hearing a lot now is the new normal. And when I listen to Ann's comments, I reflect on the fact that maybe it's not so much the new normal, because I don't think we can continue to think in terms of a steady state or think statically. I always think in terms of the next normal. So it's that agility that we have got to develop and hopefully work toward mastering. And that's what we really want to focus on today, to help us all kind of think a little bit broader and think forward and how we move forward in an effective and meaningful way. I'm going to start by asking Lee Connor to talk with us about transport and logistics risks. So Lee, can you tell us what challenges have emerged in transport and logistics as a result of the current global health crisis we're experiencing?
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Mi Jong, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, and good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are. Yes, if we were having this discussion 3 months ago and we were talking about the risk involved in the transport and logistics aspect of international trade, I'd be talking about what are your Incoterms, whose responsibility is to move the product from point A to point B. Is it the importers? Is it the exporters? What are your payment terms? Are you sure you're going to get your money for this export transaction? What kind of risk are there to your cargo as it's in transit, and whose responsibility is it to ensure or mitigate those risks? What about your forecasting and planning as to when you have to make your orders, and how does the shipping aspect integrate with that, and your transit times to meet your requirements? We'd also be talking about your compliance obligations, whether you're an importer or exporter, because it's a heavily regulated industry. So all those risks are still there. But of course, today we have the whole impact of the coronavirus and the world pandemic, which is changing our lives. Just briefly, as Brenda mentioned, we are freight forwarders, customs brokers. So in that capacity, what that means is we're representing the importer or the exporter, and we're taking care of all the logistical arrangements to move their product from point A to point B. And we handle products to and from almost anywhere in the world. So there's always challenges in various parts of the world. The challenges are greater than others. But the transport and logistics challenge is one piece of that. The compliance is another major piece of that. But in terms of navigating your supply chain challenges because of coronavirus, there's extra questions to ask now. One may be, if you're importing, is your source even functioning? Are they working right now? Is that supplier going to be reliable for you? If you're an exporter, is your customer even working by now? Do they still need your product? Is that order they put in reliable? Are you going to get paid for that order? Because they may not even be functioning right now. The transport system itself is another interesting topic right now, and the impact that the coronavirus has had on them. The good news is that in all the shelter in place or lockdown orders that have been issued, mostly by state governments in the US, transport workers are considered essential. So from that standpoint, we are able to get out and move around to get to our places of business. Now, in our side of the business, we do most of our work with a computer and a telephone, and most of our staff is currently working from home, and we're up and running with normal operations. Of course, the exceptions to that are where we have a couple warehouse facilities where we have to receive or load out freight. And those are our employees who, they are essential, so they're allowed to be out, and we have to ask them to come out and leave their homes and physically handle freight and get near people sometimes. So we're taking specific safety precautions for them to prepare for that. But the transport system itself has been deeply affected by that. And we saw the wave of the world pandemic very vividly in our business. So for example, it was only 4 or 5 weeks ago that our import customers were jumping up and down and screaming because they couldn't get product from China. What was the problem? I ordered this a month ago and I can't get the product. Why can't you get a booking of my cargo on a ship or an airplane? Well, that's because in China, with their shutdown occurring at that time and being at its height, factories weren't producing. Employees couldn't get to their work in the factory. So there was a real slowdown in producing the product and being able to ship the product. And US importers were really struggling with that. Fast forward, only about 3 or 4 weeks later, we started to see our import customers make bookings, and we started to get freight actually start to move again out of China. And only a week or 2 after that, some of those same customers who were screaming for their freight 5 weeks before that were starting to put the brakes on. And wait a minute, we're going to cancel that order, cancel that booking, because the demand had decreased so much in the US and the economic impact there was so great that those importers weren't sure they would be able to sell that product. Or their distribution centers were starting to fill up because they couldn't move the product that they already had in their inventories. So those are big problems and big challenges that we're facing. The other aspect of that is some of the actions that were taken to address the issue. For example, were when we stopped allowing visitors from China, and then later on from the EU. So the first thing that happens there is all these passenger airlines are canceling flights. Much of the air freight that moves today moves in the belly of passenger airlines. So right away, a good 30 to 50% of the capacity to move air freight was gone. Now there are still some passenger flights moving. There are still freighter and charter operators trying to move in to fill that gap, but it's nowhere near enough to fill the gap that's created by the loss of the passenger airlines to move cargo by air freight. So what we have is a situation where there's not enough capacity for air freight, and where there is capacity, and if you can get a booking in space, we're faced with extremely high prices, sometimes triple or quadruple what the normal rates are, which is deeply affecting supply chains that didn't factor that in their planning at the beginning of the year or before that. And that's been where the greatest and deepest impact has been up to now. On the ocean freight side, similar things are happening, not quite to the degree of air freight right now, but it's getting worse. What's happening is the carriers are responding to that reduced demand in the US, and they're canceling sailings, whole sailings of ships. So where you used to have a reliable shipping line service that you knew was going to be making weekly sailings from various Asian ports, and then going to Prince Rupert in Canada, and then Seattle, Tacoma, and then San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, Long Beach, you could rely on that every week, those ships coming in. Well, now some of those ships are not coming in. So if your cargo is urgent or important and you miss a sailing that was canceled in Asia, you're now at least a week behind. And because they're moving ships out of their services, now we're faced with a situation where the ships are filling up in some cases, and the cargo is getting rolled to a next vessel if they don't have space for it. So that's an example of some of the immediate impacts of coronavirus on the transport and logistics sector.
Wow, Lee, thank you so much for peeling back the layers. I'm sure there are a lot of those things that we wouldn't have occurred to us from the outside as civilians, I will say. So I have two questions, one coming from our audience, but I want to ask you one question in terms of what can you do as a logistics provider? What kinds of changes have you made to address some of these challenges that you're experiencing with your clients?
Well, we add value in the normal times because we do have a worldwide network of agents that we've developed relationships with, so that we can look after the cargo interests. If it's an export, our agents helping to clear through customs and deliver and coordinate with the customer of our exporter. If it's an import, they're reaching out to the supplier, the manufacturer, the factory, and coordinating when the cargo is ready, making arrangements for the pickup, and booking the space on the airline or the ship, and moving the cargo to the terminal so it can be loaded timely. So that's our normal activities. But in this times where the capacity is so far reduced, we have to work a lot harder to find good options. Very, very, very limited in air freight now, but even on the sea freight side. So the fact that we have a presence on the ground in the countries of origin or the countries of export that can work with us and find those has the local knowledge to find those options is very effective and helpful. But we have to work much harder, much longer to find those options right now. That's one place we can add. The other thing we try to do is educate our import and export customers. This is the reality on the ground. So you have to adjust your inventories, adjust your forecasting, and maybe make your plans to move up a little early in the calendar to be sure that your product's going to move in a timely fashion to meet your requirements if you're an importer, or to satisfy your customer if it's an exporter. So this is where our overseas partner relationships are really paying off for us right now.
So interesting. So much comes down to relationships, doesn't it?
Yes.
And so when you think about you answered this in part with that response, but when you think about our post-COVID environment, how do you think the global logistics landscape will change?
Well, that's one of the most difficult aspects of this whole world pandemic is the uncertainty of where it's going to take us and how deep is the problem going to be, how long is it going to be. and what's going to be the ultimate result from an international business standpoint. In the US, we're familiar with the big, huge government-sponsored plans to try to help businesses carry through this bad time. There's already talk about it maybe not being enough, or maybe it not lasting long enough. So one of the big questions is the carriers of the airlines and the shipping lines, those have been industries where the stability financially has gone through its peaks and valleys and ups and downs. But we're facing a period now which is unlike any other, really. Maybe the financial crisis 10 years ago was close to it, but there's real concern about, is this going to be the death knell for some of these airlines or some of these shipping lines?
Yeah.
And, you know, it's not going to be good for the overall shipping community if our options for moving product are reduced. You can imagine the situation with prices going up and scarcity of opportunities to ship things. So that's one of the concerns about where things are going in the future. I've heard some other things on the political side as to there's a real visible need that's being recognized that the government has to invest in infrastructure. So maybe that would be a boon for some of the infrastructure requirements that have been neglected that affect our transportation system. Or the alternative option I'm hearing is that because there's so much investment having to go in to keep businesses alive, that maybe infrastructure will take a backseat for a while, and that'll be slowed the progress of improving our infrastructure. Those are a couple of items that are a concern going forward after the coronavirus is brought under control.
All things for us to really keep an eye on. And, you know, there's some good questions coming in terms of, you know, how we start to think differently. And I want to hear the whole group's response to that. So we'll table those till a little bit later. But thank you, Lee, for that. That was really interesting, gives us a lot to think about. Next, we're going to hear from Ethan Kapstein, and Ethan's going to talk with us about systemic risks, particularly in shadow banking, and draw some contrast between risks that we perceive to have the most impact, such as the pandemic, but also with a view toward more systemic risks that may be as disruptive.
Thank you, Brenda. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I will go through them quickly. Good day, everybody. I guess my big message is that I want to distinguish between what I call exogenous risks, like pandemics, and endogenous risks that arise from our institutional failures, like climate change or like those that we see in financial markets that I'll speak about today. And my big takeaway is that in some respects, and perhaps counterintuitively given the current environment, those exogenous shocks like pandemics are easier for us to deal with. And I'm not complacent about it, but easier for us to deal with than the endogenous shocks that arise again from institutional failures. And I'll actually show a little data to make that point. Okay. So I'm going to do that, as I say, focusing on financial markets. So financial systemic risks are risks that can be calculated in terms of how much capital banks would need to raise in the event of a financial shock, as occurred in 2008. And they're really driven by estimates of how much capital calculated by the equity value of the firm. So what regulators do is look at the largest publicly traded banks and think about how much capital they would have to raise in equity markets in order to be back to normal operations in the event that the value of their liabilities fell. One reason, just parenthetically, why Lehman Brothers was not saved initially is that bank regulators just didn't think it was systemically important. It only needed about $50 billion of capital, which was very small compared to a Citicorp or a JP Morgan. It was so small that regulators didn't see all the interconnections, and therefore they didn't think it needed that kind of bailout. And so it is a very kind of narrow definition that doesn't take into account interconnections, and it only focuses, very important for our purposes, on the largest publicly traded institutions. Okay. You'll see from this chart the amount of systemic risk that exists is about the same today as it was in 2008. we haven't really done anything to limit the amount of systemic risk during that time. Okay? So one of the new risks in financial markets, really dating from around the time of the financial crisis, is what we call shadow banking, which is rather a nefarious term, but it simply refers to credit intermediation that takes place outside the regulated banking system. And that includes all these mortgage lenders, payday loan providers, investment and money market funds that provide credit, among many other sources. These are not included in most systemic risk calculations. So there's a lot more systemic risk that exists, okay? Now, as I said, I consider this an endogenous risk because this shadow banking arose as a response to the tightening in credit markets that occurred after, in the latest instance, the 2008 financial shock. And as I've said, I'll hypothesize that endogenous risks are more difficult to manage because they arise from our political economic equilibrium or decisions. And just think about the difference in the policy response to 2008, where we failed to solve Lehman Brothers, where there's a ton of political debate, the congressional debate over TARP, the Senate ultimately passes it 74-25. In Congress, there were very sharp divisions over these packages. I'm sure all of you online and among the participants recall these debates. And think of the CARES package that just recently passed unanimously. The fact is, there was a very kind of technocratic solution to this exogenous shock that we're now facing, and there will be a technocratic solution to it. And we kind of know what that looks like. So, as I say, to some extent, dealing with this exogenous shock is easier than dealing with some of the endogenous shocks or risks that arise because of our failures. I think we all kind of know, it's going to be a long time. I'm not complacent about getting out of COVID, but we kind of know what is needed to get out of it. And you look at, we talk about this year of bipartisanship, 100-0, they pass a bill. When's the last time that happened in the US Congress? Okay. So just to show you some quick data, you see this rise of shadow banking to become a larger share of loan debt in the United States since 2008 than loan debt that's generated by financial institutions. About 65% of loan debt is now outside financial institutions. What's critical here is that shadow banks have no lender of last resort like the Fed. There's no backstop. And so if these important institutions fail, it's not obvious who comes in to bail them out. And that would make it a source of political debate. Who's responsible if this shadow banking sector goes south? Chinese, to some extent, have made greater advances thinking about that than the US or certainly the European Union has. Just to give you another piece of data, look at the non-bank share of mortgage origination. Over half of the mortgages in the United States are originated by non-banks. Again, institutions which have no bank's backstop if they fail, no official backstop. And then I have just some charts. I can leave them with the chamber, and you can share them with participants if they're so interested, just to show who the different players are, the non-bank players. One thing that I'll show you, which I think is particularly interesting on this chart, this is Europe, where you have about $40 trillion of euros in shadow banks. Most of which, at least half of which, is in this gray column called residual other financial institutions. That's a way of saying we don't know where that money is. It could be offshore, it could be in vehicles that we can't trace, it could be in the Cayman Islands. We just don't know where that risk is located. So half of the shadow banking risk in Europe, they don't even know where it's located, geographically or in terms of what type of vehicle. So if you were depressed about COVID, maybe this will even, you'll go out for a drink after this session. I don't know.
We can't.
Right, exactly, virtual one. Here's some data about China. The only interesting thing about China is that much of the shadow banking in China takes place via firms, one firm lending to another firm. That happens with banks acting as the agent for those arrangements, but the bank has no liability for those arrangements. Nonetheless, there is a view that if shadow banking collapsed in China, the Central Bank of China would move in. So how do we mitigate these risks? I told you, Brenda, I'd get through all my slides quickly within the 8 minutes, promised you. I think there are 3 critical tasks for risk mitigation. One is data collection. We have to do a better job of collecting data on this shadow banking sector. We have to identify where that 20 trillion euros is. We desperately need international cooperation in this sector. A large share of that 20 trillion in Europe is somewhere offshore. And so we have to have international cooperation among financial regulators to figure out where that is. And then we have to start accumulating best practices for dealing with these risks, like stress testing of non-banks, which some, for example, one of the big payday providers in the US is voluntarily doing. And that should be spread across the shadow banking sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, there's so many things that come to mind when I think about this. I think about the care package and other stimulus packages that are being generated, not just in the United States, but globally in response to the impact of COVID-19. And I hear people saying that, yes, they've said the money is available and I should be able to go and work with my bank to get it, but that in reality, that's not happening. And so do you see the existence or the existence of shadow banking as a barrier to accessing some of those?
That's a really great question, Brenda, and something I should have emphasized. In fact, you might see shadow banking enlarging in response to some of those failures. Just what happened after 2008 is obviously there was a lot of new regulation placed upon the banking sector. And that ended up in all around the world, in the United States, Europe, and in China. You had incredible credit tightening. And that made it harder for the traditional banking sector to intermediate credit. And other actors, of course, said there's a market opportunity there. We will provide credit, money market funds, hedge funds, some law firms, all kinds of actors got into this business, consulting firms, into the credit intermediation, mortgage companies, into that business. So one could conceivably see, actors in this shadow banking world coming in to buy the liabilities. And, that's not a bad bet, right? Because if you think that COVID is kind of a one-year snowstorm, as Ben Bernanke calls it, 6-month to 1-year snowstorm, and I kind of like his analogy, that's not crazy to buy up those liabilities today and cash in on them later.
Okay.
By the way, just one other thing that might be of interest to participants, the rise of fintech. So another new actor in shadow banking is fintech. And so you have the marriage of the tech firms with the financial world. Again, these tech firms are not regulated as banks, but they're becoming increasingly large players in this world.
All right, thank you so much. We have a couple of good questions coming in. I'm going to hold them so that you can hear the full perspective from the panel, and then we'll field them appropriately. Next, I'd like to invite Brett Bruin to the forefront. Brett, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Brenda. And thanks to the Global Chamber for bringing us all together. It's obviously a difficult time for companies that are both trying to navigate the current crisis. But one of the messages that I'd like to leave participants with is to focus not just on this present crisis, but the next crisis. And you'll see on the screen a chart that I use both with clients as well as my students at Georgetown in our crisis communications class. And I think something that all of us can do right now is to dust off those crisis management plans, the crisis communication strategies, and evaluate both in light of what's transpired over the last several weeks and months, as well as the weakness and the weak position where we will emerge from this crisis, both wary and also weakened. I think we'll see vulnerabilities that have been germinating during this crisis put a number of both sectors and companies in a very precarious position. So I'd like to share three core concepts. One is, and this slide reflects part of a process of a crisis audit, looking at yourself in the mirror, looking at your teams, and looking at your organization, assessing what are your strengths. Many of us during crisis get a lot of energy and adrenaline pumping through our veins. We rise to the moment. And then there are those of us who would just prefer to hide under the desk, batten down the hatches, and try to ride out the storm. It's critically important for you and for your team to understand who you and they are in crisis, because many of our crisis plans are built upon assumptions. They're optimal conditions of who we will have and how they will act, and we'll all be able to perform. Then look below that initial level of responsibility. In the case that those people, that those resources aren't there or aren't ready, who will step up? What will be used? And understanding the kind of support that you, your team, and your organization need is critically important. Next slide, please. I've talked about, going back to my time working on crisis at the White House and overseas as a diplomat, the need to push forward our response. And I think one thing we all can take away from this current COVID-19 crisis is that we acted too slowly, both from a government standpoint, but also from a business standpoint. And what I have been speaking about for several years now is the importance of engaging in that initial stage. This is when the problems start percolating, the gears are creaking, and many of us say, well, we'll wait and watch. Well, if you wait and watch, you will wait and see what happens as we get into an increasing stage of crisis. And here, your options are more limited, if you can click through to the increasing stage. This is the point at which you don't have that same flexibility, and you are starting to see a much more significant crisis take hold. And yet, it is critically important, and we'll talk through, you can actually click through all of these. I think it'll be easier for us. You can see, even in that increasing stage, how you have opportunities for engagement. Many of us, many of our colleagues in crisis would simply prefer to put out a shortly worded statement and to hope that that will suffice. Unfortunately, in crisis, it is essential that we get out there and we engage our stakeholders, we engage on social media and in traditional media, because if we are not telling our story, someone else is. And this is a capability which I think needs to be developed post-COVID-19, because these storms, the regularity of risk that I often refer to, is only going to worsen. And if we don't have that capability created ahead of time, if we, our CEOs and our leadership are not ready to get out in that difficult moment and have those tough conversations, then we will suffer from the next crisis. Next slide, please. So here's what you can do. The notion of a countermeasure goes back to this idea, and if in Mandarin, for those of you who are familiar, the word crisis actually has two symbols. One is danger, but the other is opportunity. And I encourage you to look at the silver lining in this new world that we are going to face of greater uncertainty and upheaval, that this disruptive change does create opportunities. And what you can create ahead of time are these countermeasures. The idea that you build the outcome that you want from crisis. Many of us look at crisis management, crisis communications as trying to reset to where we were. I hate to break it to those who are optimistic, but there is no going back, whether it's in this crisis or the crisis that will next befall your companies. You have to set new goals and countermeasures, essentially a template, a tool that you can deploy against those most likely, those most damaging vulnerabilities. tested as well as capable of being tweaked on the fly will help you to not only survive the crisis, but then to create the next opportunity for your company, for your sector. Because many of us in these moments of crisis become paralyzed, we become focused on just fighting the fire. And yet, if we've taken the time beforehand to build the capability that we need around that vulnerability, we can then take it and transform the difficulty into the next stage for our company. Thank you.
Wow, Brett, that is so powerful. You've actually answered a couple of the questions that we had just looking at best practices, and you've certainly shared that with us. I would ask, though, for you to really be specific about what you see as the greatest misstep you see organizations taking when it comes to crisis communication.
Well, I alluded to it before, but I think if you take a hard look at your crisis management plans, there's a lot of assumptions built into them. And this is a moment where we are all thinking about crisis front of mind to take those plans to really stress test them, as was suggested by the previous panelists. We need to stress test financial institutions. You also need to stress test your plans, your processes, and your people. And I'm not talking about putting them around a table and doing a fictitious exercise or scenario. How do you put yourself, how do you put your team into scenarios that are really going to both test them as well as to develop their capability in crisis? I think this is a new phenomenon. I was talking yesterday to some students at Georgetown about how in universities, I think especially in MBA programs, nobody should be graduating these days without having developed certain crisis capabilities. And I'll leave you with just this one point. The crisis planning often takes place at an executive level. It's the C-suite. In fact, if you look at studies, most mid-level managers have no idea what their company's crisis plans are, let alone the folks on the factory floor. And yet, who are going to be the first ones to spot the problems? It's going to be the workers. It's going to be the contractors. Integrate your team, including, I've done several of these talks for the International Contract Managers Association. Integrate into your contracts capabilities for those risk indicators, for that crisis infrastructure, and for these countermeasures. Because if you involve them in the creation of these countermeasures, you're going to be much more likely to report problems when they see them and feel empowered to deploy those solutions.
So everybody in the organization needs to be scanning the environment and know how to respond and how to react to these things.
Absolutely, and I do apologize. Unfortunately, this is a busy time for us crisis communicators, so I do have to sign off, but I'm glad to answer questions virtually.
Brett, thank you so much. So helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks again.
Great. Trevor Jones, using big data and mapping technology to help analyze complex risks. Tell us all about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to piggyback off a couple things that Brett said strategically. So the fear and the uncertainty, certainly I appreciate what he said about, putting the data metrics in the contracts themselves. So we create a framework for robust data collection. And this is really a great time to get your data game together organizationally. As the kind of outbound sales and marketing processes slow a bit, it can be a great time to look at those internal procedures. And certainly part of reducing some of that uncertainty and fear and anxiety organizationally and personally is to get great data, right? Understand what's happening on a granular level in your community or on a broader scale. What we have not excelled at during this current crisis is what you'll hear referred to as contract tracing or track and trace of where specifically sick and infected individuals are. As everybody knows, because we're all sitting at home, we've taken a blanket approach to this, a broad quarantine and lockdown, which, if you have the technology and the granularity of data to go ahead and look, where specifically infections are, you can reduce a lot of that kind of blanket response. I had a call earlier this morning with a partner in Switzerland, and The Swiss are always great to talk to, but he thinks that, we're kind of overreacting, right? But it's not that we're overreacting, it's that we don't have the data to properly, create a response that's going to be completely appropriate and granular in scope. So at Lynx, what we're really involved in is trying to give companies, and now actually the public with a coronavirus data set, the ability to become very granular and track and trace kind of what's going on. I guess in peacetime, so to speak, before the current crisis, we're very involved with some longer term risks, things like environmental risk, political risk, social risk, to people, property, and the planet, and profit, of course. We do this through technology. We're really big on disrupting the legacy consulting model. Everybody's aware of the big players out there in legacy consulting, and they're happy to charge you $500,000 a year for PDFs or spreadsheets, and we're trying to really go beyond kind of that high level macro country analysis down to the granularity. So track and trace for Corona is actually a really good example. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to show you what the platform looks like that we provide to enterprise. The main sectors we sell into are extractives, security and geostrategic, and political risk as well. And then also just a strictly security function as well that we sell into. And the reason for that, especially on the extractive side, is because those companies don't really have a choice, right? They can't move like a factory can. They can't kind of have the agility that services-based industries can. So their risk is really embedded and in place. And we can also help them with stakeholder outreach and ESG, and we wrap that into our risk package as well. I'll go ahead and share my screen, and if there's any problems with sharing, just kind of let me know, Brenda, or give me the signal and I'll cut it off. But
Sure.
Look at a broad range of risks with the Lynx mapping platform. I've loaded a couple data sets so we can see them. This is actually an environmental risk, and Anne actually kicked this off really well, mentioning the state of how environment plays into the complex system that is risk and more of a geopolitical or socio-political context as well. So what we're looking at actually is flooding risk globally. I actually used to live in New Orleans, Tulane University, if there's any green waivers out there. But as you can see, even domestically, we face a really severe environmental risk here on the coast with some of the flooding. But if we zoom out more broadly, we can start to see how some of those risks could then start to affect other pieces, other risks in other sectors. So that cross-sectoral nexus. So as we look at flooding risk there in Nigeria, maybe we'll overlay historical terrorist attacks and insurgent violence from the last 15 years. And then we can start to see some overlap, right? We start to see, and we can build patterns about how environmental conditions will affect human conditions, onto security conditions, human rights abuses and supply chains, all kinds of things that we can start to interpret using the data. And it isn't to take away the human analysis. In fact, it's quite the converse, to really augment the great consulting and academic work that's going on out there, while simultaneously, of course, disrupting that legacy consulting model that might be a bit too costly, considering it doesn't really rely on data and kind of the ground truth. A couple other data sets I'll just end with to emphasize our global connectivity. We mentioned shipping lanes earlier. That was a fantastic kind of outlay of some of the risks there. We don't have shipping lanes loaded up at the moment, but we can look at some other supply chain issues. Let me just go ahead and clean up the map here a bit. So we have ports around the world. We can look at things like oil pipelines, something like illegal mining, right? Something that has vast both corporate business continuity issues for our enterprise clients, but also really vast impact and development issues as well on the ground. So as many of you probably know, illegal mines are quite devastating in terms of the, both the social and the environmental risk. And of course, that hurts the competition for, some of our clients as well. So wanted to give some quick visualizations there. I mean, really the point being that as we've seen through Corona, I mean, what happens abroad really matters, analyzing risk through a hyper granular data approach it's very, very important. I mean, it's absolutely crucial, and you'd be surprised at how, I guess, qualitative much of the analysis is out there. Again, we can't get rid of the human element when we're analyzing the data. That said, we just want to be really robust about both, right? Great clean data going in, great visualization so we can communicate the risk message and that narrative quite quickly. And then of course, great consulting on top that'll help companies and enterprise deal with those crises as they come along. The kind of last one I'll end with, this was from the early days. It's a coronavirus data set domestically here in the United States. You can see some of the hot spots starting to kind of come about on the East Coast. I don't have the exact date of when this was right in front of me, but this was kind of earlier on before things got a little bit more drastic. So you can see those clusters on the West Coast, and then of course, New York, where it's become pretty significant, showing up with that red spot. So wanted to show the platform, of course, just as an overall example about how we can use big data as a tool, right? Anne mentioned tools and frameworks. You know, we can be armchair analysts all day, but let's really go out and look at what's happening on the ground. Let's get hyper granular with it. And that will reduce some of the uncertainty and anxiety, I think, that we're all feeling when we know what's really going on, what the ground truth is, and we can stop some of those cognitive suppositions that always kind of crop up and happen all the time. So on that note, I do hope everybody is safe and secure with their families and colleagues, and everything's all good in your world. And with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions or anything like that.
Trevor, thank you so much. So one question I have is most data private, or can we source public data to assess risk?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So, you know, most data is public, believe it or not. We do layer proprietary data sets, you know, under the open data sets for our clients when we get engaged. But you would be very surprised, pleasantly surprised, when you see how much data is out there that's accessible. A lot of it is cleaning it and crafting it and visualizing it so it's useful for the consumer. But it's always growing as well. So I think last time I heard, I think it would take 5 or 6 million individual human beings to view all of the YouTube footage that comes out every day. So very important that we've developed tools to process all of that open data. That's a different story, right? We got to move through the data, but by and large, you would be surprised at just how much you can do with openly available data sets.
Okay, don't want to put you on the spot, but if there are some data sources that some of us can think about, you know, that are emerging to begin to use in this way, that would really be helpful. So
absolutely, we have opened up the platform to researchers and companies that want to see the ongoing coronavirus data set. Kind of the other piece of what we're doing, if I think my screen is still sharing, is we're getting sentiment data on different pieces. These happen to be for assets, but if we look at some of the social media data that's coming in, we could do some of this same analytical work around coronavirus itself. So we'd be happy to engage in those discussions. You know, there's a lot of benefit for us in quickly visualizing data and then doing a deep dive after the fact and doing some great data science underneath. So happy to open that up in this time. It's not putting mine on the spot at all. We're happy to kind of open that up and have those conversations.
Much more impactful than the PDF. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Dr. Anne, we've taken in quite a bit up to this point. Now, I ask that you please help us get our heads around all of this and really help us to think about how to think more broadly.
In 8 minutes, sure. Happy to do that. I want to pick up a few themes from my fellow panelists. And first, I want to thank them. I think this has been absolutely fascinating. Starting with Ethan's point about endogenous problems are harder to solve than exogenous because they have all these vested interests and et cetera. And I think he's absolutely right, but I'd go a step farther, because if you look at all the spheres that are needed for human well-being, the political, the natural, the economic, they're all becoming more fragile and harder to manage, and they all interact, which means that a lot of what we would like to think of as being exogenous shocks that somebody else's problems are actually being endogenized. It's all becoming one massive system. And to give you some examples, we have an economy that's producing rising inequality, a physical environment that's characterized by extreme climate variability, collapsing ecosystems. All that makes it harder for the average household to fend for itself, which leads to more divisive politics. The polarization makes decision-making less likely to foster societal resilience. And we know we're going to need more of it because we can already see the climate impacts that are going to be unpredictable in their specifics, but the pattern is really clear. We have a corporate and financial sector that we have forced to become hyper-efficient, which makes it fragile and brittle. We make it difficult for the corporate sector to think in terms of social value production rather than financial value production. And combine that with weak political and regulatory oversight, that's making the whole climate emergency worse. That's making other emergencies harder to manage. It has eviscerated much of our public sector. So you have all of these problems interacting with each other, and all the risks are becoming endogenized, which makes for a highly complex system. And I think this really picks up on a couple of the points that some of the other panelists made. I really like Brecht's point about the regularity of risk is only going to worsen. Your point, Brenda, about there is no new normal. There's no equilibrium to go back to, and there won't be. But if we think of black swans as being the new normal, because I think that's one way to put it, for decades, we've been treating businesses, whole economies, whole systems, as though they were machines that we could tinker into optimal performance. And what they really are is complex ecosystems that at best we might be able to garden, which is a metaphor that gets used a lot. So we've created systems that are brittle, that are fragile, they are not resilient. And resilience is probably the most important characteristic for any organization or any society or any system that is hoping to survive in the longer term. And longer term, I mean a few years and beyond. Because we can expect that in this highly interactive system, there's going to be constant, what appear to be exogenous shocks, but are actually built into the system. You can even look at the pandemic as being that. It's part of a system of global interaction that we've been building for decades. So with this hugely complex, very many interacting pieces with lots of potential for any one small thing, like a mutation of a single virus, to bring down the whole system, but you can't predict when or where that's going to happen. How do you make decisions, and how do you manage and run and govern organizations and societies under these conditions? Well, there's a whole lot of potential tools. In the short term, within an organization, you focus on a degree of transparent communication that is far beyond what most organizations do, because you never know where the useful information is. And there are techniques for doing that. You very actively break down the silos, which, this is becoming standard management advice, but there are very few organizations that actually do it effectively. One place that I have found a lot of expertise in this is coming out of actually the US military, Special Operations Forces. General Stanley McChrystal pioneered a lot of this work and has done some wonderful writing about it. It takes quite a lot of dedicated leadership effort to be able to make this work, but it can be done, and it makes it possible to get through crises. This is related to a lot of the points Brett was making as well. But getting beyond the next few weeks, beyond the crisis, there's another set of tools that are not the ones that we normally teach in management schools or public policy schools, or not the ones that most consultants give to their businesses, but they are the ones that are actually going to make it possible for organizations and societies to be resilient. One is using a lot of scenarios. And these are scenarios not in the sense of, let's pick a couple of things and try to predict what is going to happen. It's, let's look very broadly by bringing together a diversity of voices at some trends that we broadly observe. And let's just play with ideas about how they might interact. And that widens the mental mindset for understanding what's the range of possibilities that you have to be thinking about. You can't assign probabilities to them. In a complex system, probabilities are unknowable. It's not hard to understand them. It is literally impossible to understand them. You never know what's going to hit you next. But what using scenarios and similar kinds of methodologies allows you to do is then prepare yourself for making decisions that are robust under this extreme uncertainty. And there's a set of techniques for Rob Lempert at RAND and a number of others have developed. How do you test a decision not against if you have a set of assumptions, what's your optimal response? That's not useful anymore. It's, here is a whole range of reasonably plausible situations we might find ourselves in. Which of the decisions that's available to us is most robust against this whole range? And that way, if you have a group of people who don't agree on what the future is likely to be, they can still agree on decisions and they can still make progress. So this idea of there being very different tools and techniques, I think is going to require us to rethink what kinds of organizations do we have? How are they structured? How do they interact with each other? And how do we think about the whole process of decision making?
Wow, this is almost like a mental workout is what comes to mind, you know, and as we go to the gym to improve our physical well-being, we now have to think of some mental calisthenics, if you will, to really broaden our minds and take a different approach to things. And so when you think about this, how should businesses think about profit maximization under conditions of such uncertainty?
I think that's a great question. A couple of things. One is the whole idea of profit maximization, especially shareholder value maximization, the way we've been traditionally thinking about it, was already massively under fire even before we got the pandemic.
Sure.
And we saw lots of signs of that. We saw Larry Fink's BlackRock letters for the last couple of years, not only saying we shouldn't be focused on shareholder value maximization, but saying we're going to use our money to try to bring about a change in how it is that companies think about what the goals are that they're testing themselves and their strategies against. The profit maximization, the way we've been thinking about it, has been what's led us to this system of hyper efficiency, get every last dollar out, and making your businesses extraordinarily fragile as a result. We certainly do not want to continue having this focus on quarterly shareholder value returns. The evidence is overwhelming that that is not what builds long-term profitability anyhow, because it creates this great brittleness and because it gets your incentives wrong. There's actually a really interesting set of thought experiments that have been going on at Mars Incorporated, where several years ago, one of the leading shareholders, a member of the Mars family, asked the question of what's the right level of profit for us? And if you start thinking from that question, you open yourself up to some much broader thinking about where does this company go? And how much value should we be extracting from society as opposed to what we are contributing to society? So that's a sort of broad question. Instead of thinking solely about profit maximization in the short term in its own terms, thinking about things like the social license to operate. If you are trying to maximize profits and you are thinking only about financial returns, you're not going to look to society, especially as we go into this era of just constant shock after shock after shock and risk after risk after risk. You're not going to be a very socially acceptable business. We're already seeing as the crisis is unfolding, businesses that are turning themselves inside out, trying to figure out how they can contribute, how they can protect their employees, are being seen very differently from the businesses that are trying to hunker down and only take care of themselves. So instead of doubling down on this shareholder value maximization and profit maximization line of thinking that was already crumbling, we can look at purpose. And you can call it a purpose-driven business or a for-benefit-driven business or a fourth sector. We're seeing a lot of this happen on the fly as businesses are trying to reconfigure themselves for an era in which the old norms about what was socially acceptable for business are crumbling very rapidly. It is already possible to incorporate as a for-benefit business. It allows you much more freedom to build resilience over time and to engage your employees and your customers and your investors in a new way than the traditional models of business do. And over time, I think we're going to see much more of a shift in this direction, which is going to take some changes in our legal structures, our regulatory structures, our tax structures, so that we're encouraging businesses not only to be focused on short-term profit maximization, but really on this broader question of purpose and social value.
We want them to be better citizens, it sounds like, and perhaps revisit values.
we want them to not be punished for trying not to be psychopaths.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've talked a bit about big data, certainly with remarks we heard from Trevor. We hear a lot about the use of AI, artificial intelligence. Can you think of any tools, and then we'll have to cut over to questions from the group. Can you think of any tools that could be helpful to us under these circumstances?
Well, I think the kind of thing that Trevor was just talking about is absolutely key, because when you're dealing with these very complex systems, what we know doesn't work is trying to look at big general averages of what's happening. That doesn't give you data that's useful. The kind of data you need are these extremely granular, detailed data, because you're looking at these very heterogeneous systems. And the fact that we can now access that kind of data in real time and put pieces together is an absolutely fundamental tool. The thing where you have to be a little cautious is that if you're trying to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to look for big patterns and predict, that's much harder to do, because all that AI and machine learning can do is show you historical correlations. It's not causal, it can't show you what's going to happen in the future. And if we're subject to shocks coming out of completely unexpected directions, AI can't help you with that at all.
Great. And thank you so much. We definitely have a lot of homework and work to do as we move forward from here. And I have a lot of questions that are coming in from the groups. I want to open it up now to entertain some of those. And the first one comes from a gentleman out of London, and he used the same term that you did, black swan. So given that there will be more black swan events when COVID-19 is over, when it gets sorted out, how can international businesses build a more flexible contingency approach in the future? And I open that up to anyone on the panel.
Well, I think this was exactly what I was just trying to drive at, is there are these sets of tools that are different from what we have been teaching and training before. It's why Thunderbird created this new master's program in Washington, that the very first course we teach is complex systems thinking and the state of the world. So what are the tools and techniques that are out there, starting with an understanding of it is a world of, black swans isn't quite the right term. I'd say it's more gray swans. We know there are patterns. We knew this pandemic was coming. We didn't know its specifics, but those of us who have looked at global public health have been saying for 20 years, something like this was going to happen. And we were not ready for it. We know that we're going to have to do massive climate adaptation. We will not be able to tell in advance what exactly that's going to look like. So contingency on steroids, I think, is what business needs to be looking at.
Thank you. I have a question for Ethan. Are you starting to see defaults from the non-banks globally and in the United States?
I'm not aware of any currently. Obviously, around 2008, there were major defaults. Some of the mortgage companies going out of business at that time, or then being purchased by banks at the encouragement of the feds to get them out of the shadow banking system. I'm not aware of large failures yet, but that could be a shoe to drop, obviously, if this crisis drags on longer than anticipated.
Okay, and one more. Is this now the time to diversify into Bitcoin due to the predictable crash of money, as we know?
Not a financial advisor, so I cannot and will not comment.
Okay. We've seen in the United States congressional budget digital currency. So and this is another question about digital currency. Is there a need for another global currency? Just what do you think?
There's a great global currency getting stronger every day. It's called the US dollar.
Right.
Okay.
Actually getting stronger every day. So for those who thought that the RMB or the euro would be the next global currency, very little evidence that that's happening.
All right. Please discuss the impact upon supply chain caused by reduced cash flow and liquidity, and how importers and exporters are bridging this gap. That sounds like a Lee Connor question.
Well, I'm not a finance liquidity person for sure, but we know that a lot of the companies that we represent, small and medium-sized business particularly, are trying to take full advantage of the government programs that are out there now. It seems like that's one thing that's currently overwhelming the banking system and maybe the government as well, trying to manage that. In terms of liquidity and having the wherewithal to get through this crisis period, you read some kind of scary things about how a lot of small and medium-sized businesses don't have the resources to get beyond 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. And we're going to find out a lot about that in the next 30 to 60 days, I think, and whether or not the government programs to support businesses are going to be successful.
The World Trade Organization news today, it says that global trade will plunge by 1/3 this year in 2020, the worst in a generation. For those who believe in globalization, I've lost it, long term, what is the prudent action right now for importers, exporters, and cross-border investors?
I can speak a little bit to the cross-border investment piece. I mean, for every restriction kind of placed on your portfolio by the current crisis, there may be an equal opportunity where you're going to achieve a similar market rate return, but actually have a great social ROI as well. And that gets into perhaps some of the social license work that Anne mentioned, or ESG would be just a great, broadly speaking, space for that. I think it is a bit more tough for importers and exporters, unfortunately, and Lee can perhaps speak to that group. But I do think if you have put some more assets in cash because of the uncertainty, then you could become a little bit more creative with what you're looking at internationally in terms of ESG or impact.
All right, thank you.
Just very quickly on the trade, just one word.
Yes.
So trade has really been going down for quite some time, and it's a big puzzle in international economics why that is. So there are a bunch of theories out there. One is just the hangover from 2008. You know, people still aren't investing in export-oriented businesses. Second theory is protectionism, you know, kind of Trump type policies, not just in the US, but more broadly. So again, people not investing in export-oriented industries. A third is demographics, that as the world population ages, we turn from tradable goods to service goods. And so you see, for example, the demand for healthcare rising. So there are lots of reasons why trade has been falling for some time. We don't really have a good handle on precisely why that is.
All right, thank you. I just want to say we are just a minute shy of our published ending time. We want to be respectful of your time. There are a lot of questions coming in, and so we'll probably have to address some of them afterward. But anyone who has the time, you're welcome to stay on a bit longer so that we can address a few more questions. This is another question for Lee Connor. What is the next norm now for CNF and trading companies post-COVID-19?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
Yeah, what is the next norm for CNF and trading companies post-COVID-19?
I don't know. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty with how this is going to impact over the longer term. And I don't have the answer for that right now. I'm not sure if anybody does.
Yeah. There are a number of questions coming in about banking reform. And, you know, those are all things that I think that we need to keep an eye on. But if you have any thoughts about that, Ethan?
Is there anything more specific, or is it just what sorts of?
Key banking financial sector reforms. What will be needed in the post-COVID-19 world? And that's more of an opinion, but.
Right. Well, I think there's been a lot of pressure on regulators to loosen, for example, the capital adequacy regulations and turn on the credit spigot. The problem is that credit booms eventually lead to credit busts. So I think we do have to be cognizant of that and recognize that we have to maintain the stability of the financial system. We will get over this crisis, but we don't want it to lead to the next one. And so I think, you know, one of the issues, and it gets to the comments that a few of you have made, that I would really impress upon people, we tend to have what's called an intertemporal problem, right? And that means, you know, there are very few incentives for us to really be concerned about the future. That's the way our political system is designed. It's one reason why you could have a quick response to the pandemic, because it was very much here and now and you had to respond to it today. But again, I think we should be wary of responses that tie our hands for a very long period of time, since this is a crisis that we will overcome within, you know, 6 months to a year, the time it takes to develop the testing, you know, the suite of interventions that everyone knows that we need. That's not going to take forever. So again, I'd be very wary of tying our hands for the future.
Sure. This one goes to Lee. Do you think there will be a trace and track measure in place to make sure people know the goods coming from all other parts of the world are not contaminated in post-COVID-19 environment?
Well, a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, for most sea freight shipments, products are on the water for anywhere from, typically anywhere from 10 days to 30 to 40 days. And so presumably any virus that might have been there when the ship was loaded is going to be dead long before it reaches the shore.
We hope.
As far as the other side of that is that, you know, although transportation workers are considered essential, workers are still at risk when they're out there driving trucks, when they're loading freight in warehouses, or when they're stuffing containers, or when they're working on terminals or working on ships. So the transportation community has been, I think, done a pretty good job of being very sensitive to that issue and taking all the precautions that are recommended by the CDC, for example. I know here in Baltimore, we had one incident on a terminal last week where it was determined that one longshoreman, I think, was possibly exposed. And they immediately followed all the protocols of isolating, tracing his contacts, disinfecting, cleaning, and they were able to isolate it and satisfy everyone that it was done well. And so the terminal did not shut down at all at that time. And they handled it, because there's a lot of opportunity for people to get sick. And that's where it has to start, I think, with making sure people are safely protected. If the people are protected, I don't think we have too much to worry about the cargo.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you everyone so much for your great questions. Thank you to our panelists for all of this wonderful information. We have a lot to process, but hopefully as we go our separate ways today, we'll think about things that we can begin to apply with intention and start to think differently about how we move forward in the coming weeks and months, and just be deliberate about making changes and recognizing that we're not going back and that we've got to plan for the way forward. And here at Global Chamber, we're here to help you do that in any way that we can. So if we didn't get to any questions, or if you think of something that comes up afterward, please reach out to us and we will certainly try to get back to you with a response. I appreciate your attention and your participation in the conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to our Executive Director, Mijong, to close us out.
Yes, thanks, Brenda, and for everybody, the panelists. I think it was just such an engaging session, and then a lot of interesting questions were addressed today. So thank you very much. And I know that a lot of people actually get connected directly with the speakers, the chat, webinar chat. But if you still have questions or wanted to connect with the speakers, just to send me an email, which is Mijeong, M-I-J-E-O-N-G @globalchamber.org. Then I will make sure to send those the questions and make sure you get connected with the speakers. So I appreciate, and then again, please stay well and then safe, and then hope to see you again, because we are rolling out a lot of webinars, very informative, and then really helping you to think about not just how to survive, but also how to thrive, so that you will be really, really busy when this COVID-19 is over. So please feel free to reach out. And then thank you very much for today to everybody. Stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.